Nothing was open. Let that sink in for a moment, because if you're under 40, you probably can't imagine it. Nothing was open. Not the shops, not the supermarket, not the petrol station, not the pub until lunchtime, and even then, only for a couple of hours. On a British Sunday in 1975, the entire country essentially closed, and what was left was something so specific, so peculiar, so completely unlike any other day of the week, that anyone who lived through it can conjure the feeling in an instant. It was quieter than quiet. It was slower than slow. It was a day that smelled of roasting meat and furniture polish, sounded like church bells and a lawnmower 2 gardens away, and felt like time itself had decided to take the afternoon off. If you remember it, you remember all of it, and if you don't, then buckle in, because this was a Sunday like no Sunday that exists anymore. Sunday morning started differently from every other morning. For a start, you were allowed to sleep in. The alarm clock that ruled the rest of your week was silent. Your dad might have been up, but he was in the kitchen making tea, not rushing anywhere. Nobody was rushing anywhere. That was the point. The first sound you'd hear, if you lived anywhere near a church, was bells. Not one bell, but a whole cascade of them, ringing out across rooftops and chimney pots, calling people to service. Whether your family went to church or not, those bells were the soundtrack to every Sunday morning in Britain. They told you what day it was more clearly than any calendar. If your family was church-going, and a lot of families still were in 1975, then the morning had a structure. Best clothes on. Hair combed. Shoes polished. You'd walk to church as a family, sit in the same pew you always sat in, and spend the next hour trying not to fidget while the vicar talked about things you didn't understand. The hymns were the best bit, because at least you could make some noise. The sermon was the worst, because it went on forever, and the wooden pews were designed by someone who actively hated the human spine. After church, there was the ritual of the Sunday papers. Your dad would have gone out early, while you were still in bed, to the one newsagent in the area that was open on a Sunday morning. He'd come back with a stack of newspapers so thick you could use them as a doorstep. The Sunday Times, the Observer, the News of the World, depending on the household. The papers would be distributed. Dad got the news section. Mum got the magazine. You got the colour supplement, if you were lucky, or the comic strip page. And then everyone sat in silence for what felt like several centuries, reading. The only sounds were pages turning, tea being sipped, and the occasional comment about something in the paper that nobody else was interested in. But the real centrepiece of a British Sunday in 1975, the thing around which the entire day revolved, was the roast dinner. This was not just a meal. This was an institution. This was a ritual with more rules than the Church of England and considerably better attendance. Your mum would have started preparing it before church. The joint would have been in the oven since mid-morning, and by noon the entire house would smell of roasting beef, or lamb, or chicken, or pork, depending on the week and the budget. The smell would drift through the rooms and out through the kitchen window and merge with the smell from next door's kitchen, because they were doing exactly the same thing. Every house on the street, every street in the town, the whole of Britain roasting meat simultaneously like a national act of worship that nobody had officially organised. The vegetables were done properly, which in 1975 meant boiled within an inch of their lives. Carrots, cabbage, peas, all cooked until they were soft enough to eat with a spoon. Roast potatoes were the star of the supporting cast, done in the fat from the meat, golden brown and crispy on the outside, fluffy in the middle. Gravy was made from the pan juices, thickened with Bisto, and poured from a gravy boat that only ever came out on Sundays. Yorkshire puddings if it was beef, mint sauce if it was lamb, apple sauce if it was pork, bread sauce if it was chicken. These were the rules. They were not negotiable. Deviating from these pairings was treated with roughly the same level of horror as wearing white shoes after September. The whole family sat down together. This was the one meal of the week where everyone was at the table at the same time. Dad at one end, Mum closest to the kitchen in case anything needed fetching, children arranged in order of age or likelihood of spilling something. The meal lasted longer than any weeknight dinner because there was nowhere to go afterwards and nothing to rush for. You were expected to eat everything on your plate, including the cabbage, which had been boiled so long it had surrendered all colour and texture and sat there like a small defeated ghost of a vegetable. Pudding followed. And on a Sunday, pudding was serious. A proper pudding. A steamed sponge with custard, or an apple crumble, or a trifle if it was a special occasion. None of this yogurt and a piece of fruit business. This was a day of rest, and a day of rest required a pudding with structural integrity. The washing up after a Sunday roast was a military operation. No dishwashers, remember, just a sink full of hot soapy water and a tea towel. The roasting tin alone required serious elbow grease, scrubbing at burnt-on fat that had welded itself to the metal. The gravy boat was soaked, the serving dishes were stacked, your mum would wash, your sister would dry, and you'd put things away wrong until someone corrected you. The whole process took 45 minutes, and it was accompanied by the radio, usually Radio 2, playing something gentle, while the kitchen steamed up and the windows ran with condensation. After dinner came the great British Sunday afternoon, and this was where the day took on its most distinctive quality. Because there was nothing to do, genuinely nothing, and that nothingness was the whole point. Dad would fall asleep in the armchair. This was as inevitable as sunrise. Within 15 minutes of the last mouthful of treacle sponge, he'd be in his chair, newspaper over his face, breathing heavily, gone to the world. He'd deny it later. He always denied it. He was just resting his eyes, he'd say, while everyone in the family knew he'd been snoring loud enough to rattle the ornaments on the mantelpiece. Sunday afternoon had a specific quality of light. Not literally, although the 70s did seem to have a particular yellowish tinge to everything, but emotionally. There was a weight to a Sunday afternoon that no other afternoon carried. The world was on pause. Traffic was almost non-existent. You could stand in the middle of your road and hear birdsong, which you couldn't hear on any other day because of the cars and the lorries and the bustle of people going somewhere. On a Sunday, nobody was going anywhere. The television, when it was switched on, offered a landscape of programming that was uniquely Sunday. There were only 3 channels, BBC One, BBC Two, and ITV, and all of them seemed to operate under the unspoken agreement that Sunday afternoon was not a time for excitement. You'd get a black and white film, usually a war film or something with Cary Grant. You'd get the big match on ITV if it was football season. You'd get songs of praise in the early evening, with congregations from churches around the country singing hymns while the cameras panned across stained glass windows and flower arrangements. Children's television on a Sunday was limited and usually religious. There was a general feeling that children shouldn't be watching too much television on the Sabbath, even in households that weren't particularly religious. You were supposed to be doing something wholesome, reading, playing quietly, going for a walk. The usual reply when you complained of being bored was that only boring people get bored, which never once helped. Some families visited relatives on a Sunday afternoon. The drive to Nan's house, the arrival, the sitting in her front room on furniture that was covered in plastic. Nan's house always smelled of lavender and boiled sweets. She'd press a 50-pence piece into your hand when your parents weren't looking. The grown-ups would talk about things you didn't understand: death, money, neighbors, while you played with a set of dominoes on the carpet or leafed through ancient copies of Reader's Digest on the coffee table. Time moved at a different pace in Nan's front room. You could have sworn you aged 2 years in a single Sunday afternoon visit. If you didn't visit relatives, you might have visitors. Aunties and uncles arriving after their own lunch, bringing a Victoria sponge or a tin of biscuits. The best china would come out, the cups and saucers with the roses on them that lived in the display cabinet all week. There'd be tea and cake at 4 o'clock, which was confusing because you'd only finished the roast 3 hours ago and your stomach was still processing the Yorkshire puddings. But you ate the cake because it was there and because refusing food in the 70s was considered mildly offensive. The walk. Every family in Britain went for a walk on Sunday afternoon at some point in the 70s. You didn't want to go, nobody wanted to go. But Dad would announce it, Mum would agree, and before you knew it, you were trudging across a muddy field in your anorak, being told to appreciate the fresh air while rain dripped down the back of your neck and the dog ran off after a rabbit and wouldn't come back. You'd walk for an hour, achieve nothing, return home cold and damp, and be told it had done you good. The most striking thing about a Sunday in 1975 was the silence. If you went outside, the streets were empty. Not just quiet, but empty. No traffic, or barely any. No shoppers, because there were no shops open. The high street, which would be bustling on a Saturday, was completely deserted. Shutters down, doors locked, lights off. This wasn't a choice. This was the law. The Shops Act of 1950 made it illegal for most shops to open on a Sunday, with very few exceptions. Newsagents could open for a few hours in the morning. You could buy milk. But beyond that, if you'd forgotten something, if you needed something, if you ran out of something, you were stuck. You did without, or you knocked on a neighbor's door and asked to borrow it. And people did. Borrowing a cup of sugar from the neighbor on a Sunday was a genuine social ritual. Nobody thought it was odd. It was just what Sundays required. Pubs opened for a couple of hours at lunchtime and then again in the evening, but the hours were short and the atmosphere was different. Sunday lunchtime in a pub was a gentler affair than a Saturday night. Men in pressed trousers nursing a pint, a game of dominoes in the corner, the smell of pipe tobacco and wood polish. Children sat outside on the step with a bottle of lemonade and a packet of crisps with the little blue salt bag inside, waiting for their dad to finish his second pint and take them home for the roast. And then Sunday evening arrived, and with it came a feeling that every person who grew up in the 70s recognizes instantly: the Sunday evening dread. That particular, specific, unmistakable, sinking feeling that the weekend was over and Monday was coming. The bath was run, not a shower, because almost nobody had a shower in 1975. A bath. You'd sit in lukewarm water while your mum scrubbed behind your ears and told you to wash your neck. Your school uniform was laid out on the bedroom chair, pressed and ready. Your shoes were polished and placed by the front door. Your homework, which you'd been putting off since Friday, was suddenly urgent and undone, and you'd rush through it at the kitchen table with a growing sense of panic, while your mum told you she'd warned you about leaving it till the last minute. Sunday evening television reinforced the mood. The Antiques Roadshow, Songs of Praise, the BBC drama serial, period adaptations and costume dramas that your parents watched with a reverence normally reserved for church. You'd sit through it because there was nothing else on, and going to bed early on a Sunday was even worse than watching people in bonnets discuss inheritance. The house settled into an earlier, steadier rhythm. Hair washed, shoes by the stairs, everything set for the morning. You'd go to bed a little reluctantly, already bracing for Monday, already half missing a Sunday that had felt like it would last forever. The kitchen was clean, the dishes were done, the leftovers from the roast were wrapped in foil in the fridge, ready to become Monday's cold meat and bubble and squeak. The day was complete. We lost that Sunday, slowly, gradually, and then all at once. The Sunday Trading Act of 1994 opened the shops, and once the shops were open, everything else followed. The silence went, the emptiness went, the peculiar quality of a day with nothing to do and nowhere to go went with it. Today, Sunday is just a slightly shorter version of Saturday. The supermarkets open. The retail parks open. The coffee shops are open. You can buy a sofa on a Sunday afternoon if the mood takes you. And there's nothing wrong with that, not really. Convenience is a good thing. Choice is a good thing. But something was lost. Something that's hard to name and impossible to replace. A feeling. A rhythm. A sense that one day a week the whole world agreed to slow down, sit still and just be. The smell of a roast drifting through the house. Dad asleep in his chair. The sound of church bells. The empty streets. The Sunday papers spread across the living room floor. The maddening, beautiful, irreplaceable boredom of a British Sunday in 1975. You wouldn't want it back. Not really. But you'd give a lot to feel it one more time.